All right. Thanks so much, everyone, for tuning in. Today, I'm going to be talking about Led Zeppelin, of course, one of the biggest rock bands from the 1970s. I imagine most people have probably heard of them before. I'm going to cover some sort of general information. We'll talk about some of their bigger songs, why their albums are important, why they're important as a band. And of course, if anyone has any questions, comments, anything else you want to talk about, feel free to write a comment, question, anything like that at any time in the chat. Of course, anybody is always welcome to interrupt me. But to begin, first things first, Led Zeppelin, they're a British rock band formed in 1968. They released 9 studio albums between 1969 and 1980 when they formally finished, although they did have some reunions, which we'll get to talking about later. Like I mentioned, they're one of the biggest selling music groups of all time, and of course, hugely influential. Not only did many of their peers look up to them at the time when they were active in the 1970s, but even today, many bands look back to Led Zeppelin's music and still consider them to be an important rock band and really people still to look up to. You can see a picture of the group here on the right side. From left to right in the front row is John Bonham, the group's drummer. In the middle is Jimmy Page, who played guitar. On the end is Robert Plant, who is the group's vocalist. And then in the back, in the second row, all by himself, is John Paul Jones, who is the group's bassist. And they had the same consistent lineup through all the years in which they were active. So for many people, many music historians, critics, a lot of people see Jimmy Page as really the founder, the beginning of the group, the one who gave the band its impetus to keep moving forward. He was already well known in London and England for being a session musician, so he had already played on many, many singles and albums, even before Led Zeppelin started to become a big thing. And he was originally invited to be the bassist for another British group called the Yardbirds. And the Yardbirds, in my opinion, are a little bit of an overlooked band, but they sort of became the stomping ground for a lot of British rock and roll talent that came out of London at that time. Not only did Jimmy Page play with the Yardbirds, but of course famously Eric Clapton did, and Jeff Beck as well played for the Yardbirds. Jimmy Page didn't last long as the group's bassist. He was definitely more talented as a guitarist, and it wasn't long before he switched that role in the Yardbirds. A lot of the material that they were working on became sort of the foundational material for Led Zeppelin. And even when Led Zeppelin first started touring, so like this sort of picture here of an early performance with Jones, Page, Plant, Bonham, the original name they actually used for themselves was the New Yardbirds. But then due to contractual issues, legal disputes, they eventually decided on this new name, Led Zeppelin. So I'd like to just play an example of the Yardbirds. They're doing a song called Dazed and Confused, which for those of you who are already familiar with Led Zeppelin, you'll recognize the name of that song. And the performance is a little bit different the way that the Yardbirds do it, but still you can definitely hear elements of what would become Led Zeppelin's song. So let's take a listen to that. So we can see a lot of elements there in that Yardbirds performance of Dazed and Confused. A lot of the elements of that song there would become eventually Led Zeppelin's version of Dazed and Confused. But of course, like I was saying before, there were some contractual issues, some legal issues, why Led Zeppelin couldn't exactly use the name, the New Yardbirds, or even just call themselves the Yardbirds. So Jimmy Page broke off from the group. He contacted his friend John Paul Jones. They already knew each other from being session musicians. John Paul Jones was already a session bassist working in London as well, and they decided to just put together this new band of new talent. Robert Plant won the position of vocalist after their first choice declined, and he recommended John Bonham to play drums. They all played together, found that they liked their sound, decided to continue forward as this group, Led Zeppelin. The name was chosen because some people thought the band was likely to fail. that it would go over like a lead balloon, or similarly like a lead Zeppelin. And so based on that sort of pessimism, the group chose a famous photo of the Hindenburg disaster for the cover of their first record. In Jimmy Page's words, he called the photo the perfect example of grace and danger. I think those were the two words that he used, which was very much the aesthetic that he wanted for Led Zeppelin's music as well. And although some people did think the band maybe wouldn't be so commercially successful, there was indeed a lot of precedent for Led Zeppelin to actually succeed. And so because they had talented musicians, because they had a clear aesthetic goal, and also because they had fantastic management, Led Zeppelin received a $150,000 advance for their first album, even before really playing any shows, doing any touring, recording any music together as a group. They received almost $1 million to say, yeah, go ahead, go do it. So I'm not going to play anything from their first record because we already did hear sort of an early example, and I'd like to move forward to talk about their second album, Led Zeppelin II, which you can see a photo of up there in the top left, or I guess in the upper left of the right side. The Hindenburg aesthetic is sort of there in the background as well. They're sort of sticking to this Zeppelin theme, and you can actually see the members of the band sort of photoshopped into this old-timey war photograph. They're there at the bottom in the front, the three of them sort of in the middle, and John Bonham you can see is all the way over there on the right. I also included a picture on the bottom of the band performing. Again, it's another shot of 1969. You can see the stage setup is relatively simple, and you can tell how early on in their career it is because of how cleanly the band is dressed. They're not really wearing any super ostentatious clothing. Jimmy Page's shirt is actually even tucked into his pants. So yeah, it's a pretty early on shot of the band. So they actually released two albums in 1969, both Led Zeppelin I and Led Zeppelin II. Both came out that year in the UK and the US, and they also toured around both those countries promoting both those albums in that year. Both Led Zeppelin I and Led Zeppelin II is basically just a document of their live shows. They're pretty much just recording the songs in the studio that they played live for their audience. So Led Zeppelin II was actually recorded while they were touring in America. It was recorded on the road, and it was more successful than Led Zeppelin I. It was their first record that went to both #1 in the US and the UK, and that trend would follow for each of their subsequent records. Every other release that they put out afterwards would go to #1 in both the US and the UK. They were workhorses as well. They worked really hard to promote their record. They toured relentlessly, played long shows. Some of their concerts actually lasted more than 4 hours from when they were touring around at this time. So I'd like to play an example, the first song from Led Zeppelin I. I'll play Whole Lotta Love. There's definitely some similarities here between Dazed and Confused and this sort of psychedelic middle section and the heavy riff at the beginning. But what you're going to hear with this song is Led Zeppelin really crystallizing their sound and their aesthetic. So there we have it. Great song. Some musicologists, some critics even cite Led Zeppelin as an early influence in heavy metal music, particularly because of Robert Plant's high falsetto vocals, Jimmy Page's heavy distorted guitar, similarly like the heavy pounding, beating drums, a heavy pounding, constant beating bass. A lot of those elements would become embellished and would eventually become some of the common tropes, of heavy metal music. So again, continuing to move forward. In 1970, Led Zeppelin released their third record, Led Zeppelin III. And so for the first time, this was sort of a step beyond what they were playing for their live audience. There's a chance for the group as a foursome to record some new, original material and really put sort of their own aesthetic footprint going forward as a band. The initial reaction to Led Zeppelin III was kind of mixed. It wasn't as enthusiastic as initial reception had been for Led Zeppelin I and Led Zeppelin II. Oddly enough, some Some reviewers, some critics said that there was too much acoustic music on the record, but Jimmy Page himself was kind of baffled and said, there were acoustic songs on Zeppelin I and Zeppelin II as well, and kind of in retrospect, people have sort of re-reviewed Led Zeppelin III, and I think most people determine now that it definitely stands on par with Led Zeppelin's earlier albums. We'll listen to an example of one of the more acoustic songs from this record. It's a song that's called Gallows Pole. So that was Gallows Pole. One of the most important things, I think, in retrospect of Led Zeppelin III was that it really set the stage for Led Zeppelin IV, which would go on to become arguably the band's biggest album, which they released the next year in 1971. But already by this time, having toured around so extensively through the States and through the United Kingdom, they were already being called the biggest band in the world. And interestingly, not ever having even a #1 single. Around this time too, the early 1970s, Led Zeppelin began to attract a reputation for offstage excess. So partying, drugs, alcohol, women, etc., everything like that. One of the most famous incidents was replicated in the movie, I think it's called Almost Famous, when one of the characters stands on top of like a shed or something over a swimming pool and announces to everyone, "I'm a golden god." That's supposed to be an imitation of something that Robert Plant supposedly did under the influence of LSD. But let's move on to talk about Led Zeppelin IV, which is, as I was saying, probably the band's biggest record. I think most people, maybe not most people, but it's definitely arguable whether or not it's their best record. Some people might even go so far as to call it a perfect album, because all of the songs on it are just so good. Every song really stands up on its own, and then the entire album all the way through has this fantastic sense of flow, and really you could just listen to it over and over and over and over again without getting tired of it. There's absolutely no filler material. It totally learns and crystallizes everything that they took from their previous 3 records, all their touring experience, and puts it together. So blues, rock, psychedelia, all those influences appear on this record. But then they also found a way to infuse some new elements of creativity and really push the envelope of what was acceptable and what bands were doing with rock and roll music in the early 1970s. Of course, the biggest song from this album is Stairway to Heaven. That's the track that we're going to listen to. But there's really no way I think we can get around talking about that song. But I'd like to go through just all of these tracks very quickly, because really they're all really important tracks, all musically interesting, that really stand up on their own. Black Dog uses an unusual time signature. Rock and Roll is just a really classic blues track. The Battle of Evermore is an acoustic-inspired song with Joni Mitchell. Stairway to Heaven is the song that we're actually going to listen to, and probably Led Zeppelin's most famous, most enduring track. Misty Mountain Hop is a keyboard-driven song, so it's sort of led by John Paul Jones. Four Sticks is kind of led by John Bonham when he actually plays with 4 drumsticks, which is why it's called Four Sticks. Going to California is another popular acoustic song from them, sort of all about the hippie movement that was happening in the United States. And When the Levee Breaks is another classic blues song, kind of almost like a guitar jam, but very heavy classic Led Zeppelin. All of these songs really show Led Zeppelin at the height of their musicianship, at their best as a band. And if you're only ever going to listen to one Led Zeppelin album, probably Led Zeppelin IV is the one to go through. So let's take a listen to Stairway to Heaven. We're going to listen to the song all the way through, all 9 minutes of it. It is kind of a long song, but I think it's worth giving it the attention. So, in addition to representing, Led Zeppelin's artistic growth from the past, it was also an indication, Led Zeppelin IV and Stairway to Heaven, they were also an indication of other things to come. what was going to be coming from Led Zeppelin forward into the 1970s. So the next album they released to follow up from Led Zeppelin IV was this one, Houses of the Holy. Of the three pictures, the album cover is the one that's the top left. This was the first record to sort of break with their tradition of just naming their albums after their band. So Houses of the Holy is Led Zeppelin V. It was released in 1973, and it did really, really well. It was commercially successful. Critically, it was well received. It contained a number of songs that went on to become staples of the band's repertoire. And although for I think most people, most people wouldn't argue that Houses of the Holy is stronger than Led Zeppelin IV. Well, I don't know. I don't want to speak for most people. I mean, they're both fantastic records. They're both very good in different ways. So in addition to that, they also toured and released a movie based on their tour, which you can see right beside the album cover. Of this film, the song remains the same. So this was sort of like a live document of their concert performances, and you can see a picture of them performing live right below that at the bottom of the screen. Indeed, true to their name as being the biggest band in the world, they extensively toured and broke records for gross revenue. Most notably, they actually beat the Beatles in terms of a total amount of dollars earned from a single show. And then in 1975, they continued releasing high-quality, stellar albums with their double LP, Physical Graffiti. Physical Graffiti also set new ground in terms of new sonic architecture, new sounds to explore, new types of song structures. And one of the most enduring songs from that album is this particular song, Kashmir. So also, related to the Beatles, but not just the Beatles, a lot of what was happening in the late 60s, early 70s, there was a lot of influence from Eastern philosophy, Eastern mysticism, Eastern cultures, and Kashmir was no exception to that. Led Zeppelin is definitely taking influences from, I would argue, Indian Gharana music, but maybe not necessarily. I think it is definitely arguable that they are influenced by non-Western music in this track. So it's another long song. It's about 8 minutes or so. We'll listen to it all the way through. All right. Okay, so almost done. For me, 1975, the middle of the 1970s, that's what really began to mark the beginning of Led Zeppelin's decline, or the beginning of Led Zeppelin's downturn, we could say. The group was forced to take a tax exile, basically like an expensive holiday from Britain, where they were forced to not work, basically. They were on vacation for over a year, which reduced their visibility in the public eye. And although they did definitely keep selling records, their music was still being played on the radio, they weren't really touring or promoting themselves internationally, doing anything new. Also in that time, Robert Plant happened to get involved in a serious car crash where both he and his wife were injured, and he actually broke his leg, which sort of hampered their ability to go out on tour and even record new music in the studio. They did record a new album, Presence, which came out in 1976. Robert Plant was still injured during the recording, so when he recorded the vocals, he was actually sitting down in the studio rather than standing up. And by the time Led Zeppelin finally got on tour to support the album in 1977, they just sort of found that the audience they were playing to wasn't the same anymore. The sort of sense of positivity, peace, and love that had dominated the late 1960s and sort of spilled over into the early 1970s had really changed. There were problems at rock concerts now. It was always a problem in the past, but even more so now with drugs and the problems that stem from those, violence. Of course, there's the famous story of the Rolling Stones using the Hells Angels as security, but lots of unintentional violence too, like fans being trampeded, for example, like at the Who concert. So just the atmosphere had kind of changed, and Led Zeppelin, not really releasing anything that sort of surpassed their previous releases, was sort of stuck at this plateau. And novelty, not really being something that they were bringing to the table with Presence. I think sort of in a big way, or at least in a big way to start, focus was starting to shift on other newer groups. We'll listen to an example of a song from Presence called For Your Life. The song was never performed live by Led Zeppelin when they were in their original formation, but they did perform it live at their reunion tour, or excuse me, their reunion show with Jason Bonham at the O2 Arena. But it's a good song. It's classic Led Zeppelin. It's a heavy, strong guitar riff with Robert Plant's high falsetto vocals, strong rhythmic section from John Bonham and John Paul Jones. But yeah, like I was saying, it's not really something new. It doesn't push the envelope of what Led Zeppelin was doing previously. I've heard people call Presence Led Zeppelin's most underrated album, which I think is probably fair. There's definitely a lot of good material on that album, and definitely I think that album it tends to get overlooked in comparison with the rest of Led Zeppelin's catalog, especially their earlier catalog of their first 6 records. So coming to a close, the band released their next album, In Through the Outdoor, to again mixed reactions. People weren't so happy with Led Zeppelin trying to update their sound. Led Zeppelin was starting to try to move in the new musical direction, trying to still be in touch with what was changing with the aesthetic of the 1980s. But in my opinion, they didn't really quite hit it with In Through the Outdoor. Tragically, John Bonham passed away a short time later in 1980 due to alcoholism. By this time in the group's career, he'd become an extraordinary alcoholic. The amount of alcohol, the amount of drink that he was consuming. I mean, you can look up stories of it online. It's inhuman. It's pretty incredible that he was able to survive for as long as he did. But yeah, unfortunately, he tragically passed away in 1980. And so Led Zeppelin released this statement about John Bonham's death. We wish it to be known that the loss of our dear friend and the deep sense of undivided harmony felt by ourselves and our manager have led us to decide that we could not continue as we were. And so with that statement, they effectively dissolved the band. They said that Led Zeppelin wouldn't make any new music, they wouldn't tour anymore, they wouldn't play any more shows. So they did release one more album, which was Coda. It came out in 1982, and it was basically just a collection of unfinished and unused tracks. They used sort of drum recordings that they had of John Bonham originally, and tried to cobble an album best together as they could. I'm going to play the song Fool in the Rain from In Through the Outdoor so you can hear how much Led Zeppelin's sound had changed. The song, it's sort of more driven by the piano than by the guitar, and I think the biggest difference for me, that is a change, but Led Zeppelin, they did do sort of non-guitar lead, yeah, that makes sense, non-guitar lead songs in some of their other albums. But here I think the biggest difference is they're sort of losing the sense of heaviness that came to define their earlier music. So let's take a listen. So, I mean, I feel like they were sort of half right. I mean, keyboard instruments would go on to dominate the 1980s. They would be a big deal. And sort of world music would become very influential in a lot of artists' aesthetic in the 1980s. But to me, I don't think Led Zeppelin quite put it together in a way that was faithful to say their original aesthetic. So of course, like I said, 1980, the band broke up. But Page, Plant, Jones, they all continued to have successful solo careers beyond Led Zeppelin. Jimmy Page and Robert Plant in particular collaborated on a number of different projects. One was actually a band just called Page and Plant, and they released 2 albums. They've also done a couple of reunion shows. So Led Zeppelin did get back together in the 1980s for Live Aid when they played with Phil Collins. He filled in for their drummer. And then, like I mentioned before as well, and you can see in the screenshot here, they also reunited in 2007 to play at London's O2 Arena with Jason Bonham, John Bonham's son, playing drums for them. Jimmy Page has also been largely responsible for being the one sort of re-releasing Led Zeppelin's music, bringing older outtakes, archival material, and making those publicly available, making them more accessible to fans and historians, etc. And you know, the O2 Arena show was so successful. I mean, just to sort of show that Led Zeppelin hasn't been forgotten. That show holds the record for the highest demand for tickets for one music concert at 20 million requests. I don't think that's been broken yet, but I feel like it's only a matter of time. But yeah, for now, that's Led Zeppelin's record. Actually, I think it would be really strange if that hasn't been broken yet. But yeah, anyway, moving forward. There are also a couple other bands that you could check out related to Led Zeppelin. So I don't think they ever released anything, but XYZ was a famous project, or it would have been a famous project, like a supergroup, using members of X, so X Led Zeppelin and X Yes members. Some of the guys were going to collaborate together on there, like a supergroup. But also Them Crooked Vultures is kind of a cool supergroup band as well, which features John Paul Jones still playing bass, but also with Josh Homme, and I think Dave Grohl is in Them Crooked Vultures as well. Led Zeppelin's legacy is that today they're still remembered for helping to popularize blues and rock music. There's sort of this reintroduction of blues and rock music to America. This sort of extension of the British invasion that started in the mid-1960s and kind of continued into the 1970s of this cross-cultural exchange, or transatlantic cross-cultural exchange. As a group, their music is remembered for being innovative and influential, complex. The members themselves are remembered for their virtuoso musicianship, their innovative and creative songwriting, and indeed, altogether creating complex and beautiful music. You can see some of the pictures on the side of how they've been honored for their cultural significance, either being decorated in the UK or decorated in the US. And so their influence extends just beyond blues and rock, really as musicians. They're sort of influential across almost all of music, I think, is fair to say. Another band, that I think is probably heavily inspired by Led Zeppelin, the newer group Greta Van Fleet. They seem to be almost a carbon copy of Led Zeppelin, down to the guitars and vocals and performance. But I mean, if it was successful once, there's really no reason, I think, why it wouldn't be successful again. So I'm going to end things there. I know there's probably much more information, or there is certainly much more information about Led Zeppelin that I could have said, but I've been going for about 80 minutes now, so that's I think plenty. If you are interested in learning more about Led Zeppelin, the best place to start is their music. Listen to their albums chronologically all the way through, starting with Led Zeppelin I, working your way up to Coda. That's a great introduction. So thanks again, everyone, for tuning in and for listening. If you're interested in my slides, in addition to this slide, I have many other slides about a lot of other bands and musicology topics available at my store at Teachers Pay Teachers. If you would like me to proofread or edit any of your work, I do have a master's degree, so you can find me at Fiverr. I'm available there as well. In addition to proofreading and editing on Fiverr, I also have music services, so music teaching services, or ESL services. You can read my blog at WordPress. Right now I'm doing a project called Classical Music Doesn't Suck, and it really doesn't. It's well worth checking out. I've got some cool information there and some cool links to some good songs that you may not have heard before. These links, they're not here on the page, but they're below if you scroll down on my Twitch page. You can also find me on YouTube, where I post my lectures afterwards. And as well, you can find me on Twitch. You can find me on Twitter. If you follow me there, you'll find links to cool songs that I like. I tend to post maybe once a day, once every other day or so. So enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Thanks again for tuning in. See all of you next week.